There are some ships that were famous in their day and age, your Enterprises and Warspites. Other ships, despite notable activities, only became famous much later. USS Ward is a classic example of the latter, an old four-stacker destroyer that was just one of many ships of her type. Most of her active career was fairly uneventful as well, with little to make note of. However, there was one specific action that Ward is remembered for, firing the first shots of the Pacific War by American forces on December 7, 1941. The reason Ward only became famous in the early 2000s is because this action was disputed. For many decades, Ward's claim was dismissed or outright ignored. Her crew swore by it for as long as they lived, but it was still argued. Until, that is, the midget submarine Ward shot at was discovered in 2002, with a neat little hole in the conning tower right where Ward's crew claimed to make their hit. Nowadays, because of this, Ward is much better known. Her wreck, on the other hand, got a bit lost in the shuffle. While I can remember some articles and reporting on it at the time, Ward's wreck got nowhere near the attention as some others, like Hornet, Wasp, or Indianapolis. I suppose it isn't terribly surprising when acknowledging the rough condition of the wreck. In this video, we'll look at it, although much of Ward's hull is hard to make out beneath decades of sea life and rust. Before that, though, the usual overview of her sinking. To understand how Ward ended up in her final resting place, it's important to understand what she became after Pearl Harbor. The destroyer was converted to a fast transport in 1942, in a similar manner to many other four-stackers. These ships were of questionable utility in combat, but they were a ready supply of fast and easily refit hulls. As a result, Ward was redesignated APD-16 and spent much of the Pacific War on transport or escort duty. It was on one of these transport runs that she met her end. Ward was supporting the liberation of the Philippines in late 1944. This would see her in Ormoc Bay in early December. This was a battleground that saw the end of quite a few ships, including such famous names as Kamikaze. Ward's end came in a classic historical oddity on December 7th, 1944. The destroyer-turned-transport was hit by a kamikaze directly amidships. This set raging fires that the crew couldn't put out, prompting the order to abandon ship. The old destroyer was beyond saving, and as such, a newer destroyer would scuttle her. That was USS O'Brien under the command of William Outerbridge, who, in another coincidence, was Ward's commander on December 7th, 1941. He ordered his new destroyer to fire on his old one, scuttling USS Ward. 3 years to the day after he had done the same aboard Ward against a Japanese midget sub. This is where USS Ward's story came to an end. Her crew continued to speak of the action off Pearl Harbor, while the destroyer silently rusted away off Leyte. It was only relatively recently, in 2017, that the wreck would finally be brought to light. Unsurprisingly, if you've been a fan of these videos, it was Paul Allen's team off RV Petrel that found Ward. This was in December 2017, which seems to be the month for anything related to USS Ward. In any case, the wreck they found was, as I said earlier, in rough shape. Ward is resting at a depth of 209 meters, or 686 feet. This is fairly shallow water, all things being equal, and the wreck shows it. Her hull is overgrown with sea life and rusted out. This is not going to be something like Hornet. Keep that in mind as we look at Ward's wreck, beginning briefly with the sonar. There's not a huge amount to say here, because this doesn't show much detail. It's very much the classic sonar look, not the detailed side scan you see on other wrecks. It looks like the hull might be broken here, but there's not much else I can say about Ward herself. Probably the most interesting thing is the massive crater outlined in purple. Without much else to cover, let's swap to the wreck, starting in this case with the singular photo of her weaponry. This is, I believe, an encrusted 20mm cannon. Ward was re-equipped during her conversion to a fast transport. This saw the old 4-inch guns taken off, including the one that sank the submarine. That weapon is preserved as a memorial to this day. To replace those weapons, Ward received 3-inch guns and 20mm cannon. This is too small to be one of the 3-inchers, and it looks like there's a magazine here. It's tough to tell with all the marine growth, but it does have the rounded shape you'd expect. Other than that growth, the weapon is in pretty good shape, considering the situation. The barrel is recognizable, and you can even make out some of the mount, along with a swarm of crabs that have colonized the general area. As for the hull, it's covered in silt and rusted out. It also seems to have collapsed, judging from the angle of the hull and the cannon itself. There aren't a lot of pictures of Ward post-refit, so I'm not sure exactly where this is. Wherever it is, it's broken up. You can see that here, where the hull is buckled and covered in debris. Everything else is hard to make out, or just completely ruined. So, with that rounding off the weaponry, it's time for the hull. Starting here, with the most recognizable bit of the entire ship. This being the extreme bow, laying on its side. The 20mm cannon from earlier might have been on its side as well. It's hard to tell how much of an angle without any indication of the ROV's orientation. It didn't look upright, but it also didn't look as extreme as the bow here. Regardless, the fact this is the most recognizable bit speaks to how bad Ward's condition is. You can see the shape of the bow here, which is still pointing forward, but much of the actual detail is lost to time. You can't see the deck from this angle, and there's no intact railing in sight. Even most of the metal is completely covered up. For example, while this might be the anchor here, it's difficult to say for sure. It's certainly a bit of metal sticking out, in more or less an anchor shape. You might even be able to see the mounting point here, but it's so covered in sea life that I can't be sure. The next picture, moving a bit further back, at least has less of that to deal with. Here we have the wheelhouse, also laying on its side. While still featuring marine life, the bare metal is much more visible here. That allows for making out the framework of the bridge. Even the wheel is still intact and visible beneath that. Considering the overall condition of Ward, I'm actually impressed that survived, especially with the bridge collapsing on top of it. There are other details that we can see as well. For example, where the hull has broken and rusted here. And above it, there's more collapsed structure. This is, presumably, the rest of Ward's bridge, or what's left of it. At this point, it's little more than scattered debris, falling on top of other broken metal. That theme continues with this shot, which is so broken up, I'm not even sure what it once was. If you told me that was the rudder after it fell off, I'd at least give it some consideration. Because, without any other framework around it, that is at least a possibility. I don't think it is the rudder, mind you. Other than the overall shape, there's not much saying that. However, there's also not much saying what else it could be. It might even be hull plating that fell away at some point and ended up all on its own. That would be my guess personally, but if anyone else has any ideas, feel free to toss them in the comments. As for the next picture, this looks like the stern. This here looks like the remnants of the propeller guard. Needless to say, if this is the stern, it's pretty much collapsed in on itself. Here you can see where the hull seems to have been bent back. That looks like things broke up at some point as decks collapsed over each other. It's not a pretty sight. This area, stern or otherwise, also seems to be on its side, just like the bow. Which, while we're on the topic, the next image might be another angle on the bow. It's very foggy and hard to make out, but the overall shape is there. However, between the image quality and the zoomed-in nature of the shot, there's not much to work with. I can't see any of the deck, and the tip of the bow is out of frame. Presuming, of course, that this is the bow. The second to last image for its part is a look at the deck. As with the others, I can't be entirely sure where on the deck. The framework here might be the davits added in the troopship conversion. but the ship is so deteriorated that if so, there's very little left. You have some frames here and here, and some collapsed debris in a gaping hole here. The deck itself, for its part, is covered in silt as you'd expect. Even a look from further out doesn't supply much more context other than a better look at the frames that might be davits. So with that in mind, let's look at the final image of Ward's wreck. This is a look at the deck somewhere along the ship. Where, I don't know, and I'm not sure it matters in this case. What's important about this image is the intact china you can see poking out of the decades of mud and rusted metal. This is the kind of thing that isn't terribly unique on shipwrecks. Titanic, for example, is famous for the amount of intact dishware that survived the sinking, and being brought up as display pieces for that matter. However, you don't normally see it on war shipwrecks, because it's buried deep in the hull, or because it was all destroyed in the sinking. On Ward here, some of it survived the sinking to end up on the deck. I would guess this came from the officer's wardroom, judging from the quality, or what we can make out of it anyway. None of the china in this shot seems to be damaged. The plates and cups are still intact, and if they were raised, would probably clean up nicely. However, Ward is not Titanic, and Petrel, when they were active, were not artifact hunters, diving on these wrecks. The dishes were photographed, presumably cataloged, and left in place. There's not much else to say with this picture. There's some rusted out hull here, but again, the focus is on the dishes. It seemed a good point to end the video. A reminder, even if not to the same extent as helmets, of the men who served aboard this proud ship. Maybe not like the preserved gun ashore, but nonetheless a reminder of the men who lived and served aboard such a historically significant ship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.